Today's online technical presentation is about to begin. If you have any questions during the presentation or after it, GGS Pro is standing by to answer them. You can use any of the four methods you see here on the screen. Hello, my name is Rick Yates. I'm Technical Services Manager for GGS Pro and Griffin. Today's recorded online presentation will be on maximizing production and the profitability of spring crops. I hope that's a topic that will be important to a lot of us. There's a lot of things we could talk about, but I'm going to center on three of them. Three things that affect crop timing. And first and probably foremost is light. So we're going to talk about the importance of the daily light interval and the effects on crop growth and time to bloom. We're going to spend some time talking about average daily temperature, and we'll define all these terms as we get to them. But we're going to talk about average daily temperature and the impact it has on crop maturity. And then we'll talk a little bit about variations in plug size and the age of plugs and the bearing that has on finish times as well. All these things will be against the backdrop of trying to maximize our profitability, making the best use of our space and the best use of our heating dollars. So let's start off talking about greenhouse lighting. We're going to talk about photoperiodic and supplemental lighting. We find in our conversations with growers there's often a lot of confusion about what those two things are, so we're going to sort that out. The first type of lighting we'll talk about will be photoperiodic lighting. This is used to alter the length of the day and the night at the same time that plants perceive. So you may be asking, why is it important? Why is the day length important? Well, many plants, not all, but many plants initiate flowers based either on the length of the day or the length of the night. In some other cases, the length of the day can have a bearing on whether or not they go into tuber production. And when that happens, there's a very little vegetative growth and flowering that takes place. And crops that would be in that category would be things like ginger and your tubers, or some people like to call them nonstop begonias. So day length really does matter. For a while, we're going to be talking a lot about long day and short day plants. So it's good to define what these terms mean. Long day plants that need nights that are less than 10 hours in length in order to initiate flowers. For most of the United States, for long day plants, in order to keep them in a reproductive state, we need to light until about April 1st. And we'll talk about lighting in a minute and get very specific about what all of that means. It's interesting that there's really no point in starting photoperiodic lighting when the plants first germinate, because they have to have 4 to 6 true leaves before they can accept the message to initiate flower buds. And once that happens, it takes about, and it does vary by the particular plant species, but 2 or 3 weeks of short nights or long days in order to cause that flower initiation. Well, on the other hand, there's not as many of these, but short day plants have totally different requirements. They need a longer night, so nights that are 13 hours or longer. And in this case, they initiate much faster. Once there's just 2 to 4 true leaves on most short day plants, a 7 to 10 day spell of short days are enough to initiate flowers. We'll get a little bit more specific. Now, there's 2 different types of long day plants. Obligate long day plants are those that will absolutely not flower under short days. And some examples of those are your tuberous begonias, again, the nonstop type begonias, fuchsias, and it might surprise you with this, but Petunia purple wave is an obligate long day plant. So if you're trying to get them in bloom faster, the idea is not to plant them earlier in the season to get them in bloom sooner. It is to light them and give them the requirement that they need in order to initiate those flower buds. The faculty of long day plants make up a much larger group of plants, and in this case they will eventually bloom under short days, but they bloom much faster under long days, and you can see from the list there's some pretty important crops there. As a grower, I used to feel like dianthus is so beautiful early in the spring and it's so cold tolerant. If we could only get them in bloom soon enough to hit that early market before everything else came into flower, that would be really advantageous for sales. And little did I know that it was a day length issue. So had we lit those and extended the day length on the dianthus, then we could have achieved what I was trying to do there. And you see some other important crops there that will bloom much faster under long days. Short day plants, a little bit more rare, but there are some out there, and the same story holds true. Obligate short day plants will only bloom under short days. Balsam, which is related to impatiens, and chrysanthemums be a good example, must have short days. Now, a lot of the breeding on chrysanthemums in recent years has taken some of the day length response out of a lot of the varieties in the push to have them bloom sooner and more profusely. But most chrysanthemums will, garden mums will initiate flowers in the middle of July. So the reason is that we have passed the longest day of the year, which is late June, and the days are actually starting to get shorter. And so it hits that threshold and they start to initiate flower buds. Facultative short day plants will bloom under long days. They just bloom much faster under short days. And some good examples there are the Rieger type begonias, Gerber daisies, your African marigolds, those are the taller, larger flower ones, and most of your zinnias and sunflowers as well will fall into that category. Day neutral plants, we have to love them. They could really care less about the length of the day. They don't require either short nights or long nights in order to initiate flowering. Now, the sunlight still is very important to them, and most plants flower by accumulated carbohydrates. So the longer the day and the longer they're receiving photosynthetically active light, the sooner they'll bloom. But it's not a day length response per se. And you can see a lot of our favorite crops are on this list, and we're grateful that they're so easy to get along with. There's a very comprehensive bulletin if you are interested in looking up the crops that you grow to find out whether or not they are day length sensitive or not, and if so, which direction. And it was written by, it was actually published by Purdue University, but also Dr. Neil Matson from Cornell University helped on this. And it's a great resource, and a lot of the information that I'll be sharing with you today you can find in this bulletin. So a little bit more about photoperiodic lighting. Unlike supplemental lighting, we're using very low light intensities. In fact, as you can see, 6 to 12 foot candles of light, not much light at all. So all we need is enough light to excite the phytochromes in the leaves and convince that plant that it is daytime, and that is enough to do the trick. Now, we talked about the fact that even though we call them long day plants, that it's really the length of the night that is what triggers the flowering response. And because of that, light interruption can be used. And what we do there is we have lights on a timer, and they typically run from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. And what happens there, we create a 4-hour day and 2 short nights on either side of it. And since long day plants require short nights, that's enough to trick them into the blooming response. By using night interruption rather than just extending the length of the day, we have to light for a shorter period of time, so we save a good bit of energy by doing that. For many years, for decades, really, incandescent light strings were the treatment of choice. And you can, if you have access to incandescent bulbs, you can still do this. And the rule of thumb is that a string of either 60 or 100 watt light bulbs, and about 4 to 5 feet apart in the row, 4 feet above the crop, will cover a bench at 6 feet wide. Most of us used pie pans with a hole poked in the middle as makeshift and very inexpensive reflectors to reflect that light down to the bench, and it's very effective. A lot of growers have asked whether or not they can use the compact fluorescent bulbs since they are much more energy efficient than the incandescents. Because of the fact that the compact fluorescent bulbs do not produce very much of the far red rays that are needed, they can be interspersed with incandescent bulbs to save some energy, but if you use that as the sole source of your light, then you'll be disappointed with the results. There are some growers also that found low output LED bulbs that aren't terribly expensive that they can use for this purpose as well. A unique way of providing light, the photoperiodic light to the crops, is something called a Beamflicker. And here we're using a much higher intensity light source, a 600 watt HPF high pressure sodium lamp in most cases. And the fixture actually rotates on a continuous basis. And it throws light in both directions quite a long distance. And some research by Dr. Eric Runkel at Michigan State University has indicated that you can get effective day length control for 35 feet on both sides of this fixture. So you can imagine that you can replace an awful lot of incandescent bulbs in your lighting project just by resorting to using the Beamflicker. There is a link to a video if you're interested in seeing it in action. The video link at the bottom of the slide there will take you to it, and I think you find it really interesting. Another unique thing, and growers are such innovative people, they find ways to figure things out. You can attach lights to booms and various types of lighting, both LEDs and LEDs, and even can use incandescent bulbs if you so choose. And the concept here is what's called cyclical lighting. The plant doesn't have to be exposed to the light for every minute during the 4 hours. In fact, 10 minutes of light every 30 minutes, and then you use 4 to 6 hours of that as night interruption. So you can picture the lights being on the boom, and the booms are set to travel back and forth at such a speed that they meet those requirements. And this is something that GGS Pro can help you with some specifics if you need it. Now, your high pressure sodium lamps and your compact fluorescent lights are damaged by being turned on and off so much, so they really are not well suited to this particular application. I worked with a grower that actually had the lights were in one place, but the baskets were on a rotating system. And so we were able to figure out how to rotate the baskets by the lights at the right speed in order to fulfill the day length requirement. So that's kind of a different twist on the same concept there. Supplemental lighting is quite different. In this case, we are supplementing the available sunlight with much higher levels of light in order to increase photosynthesis and enhance crop production in a lot of ways. As you can imagine, this is going to be more expensive because we're going to have more sophisticated lighting, and we're going to use a lot more energy to create all of this. So we have to take a look at where is it financially feasible, where does it pay to add high levels of light to the available sunlight during the wintertime in order to improve crop growth. Well, propagation is one of the areas that we see the most benefit, and the high levels of light, and remember, most of your propagation is taking place during the darker months of the winter where the available ambient light levels are quite low to start with. So by adding supplemental light in these situations, we get much better crop quality. The plugs tend to be shorter, more compact, and branch in a superior fashion. But not only that, they finish much faster, and the ability for a propagator to get more turns out of the same space is another way that you start to offset the cost of the lights. There are some high value blooming plants that bring enough money back in that the reduced crop time and improved quality will make it pay. A large venue for using supplemental lighting are greenhouse vegetables and herbs, and in this case we are improving quality through the winter and reducing crop time. Dr. Runkle from Michigan State University says that a 1% increase in the daily light interval equals a 1% increase in yields, so that you can really calculate your payback pretty effectively that way. Now, we haven't talked about daily light interval yet, but we're going to cover that here in just a minute. In fact, let's do it now. Since we're going to be talking about lighting, I definitely don't want to go overboard on heavily technical terms, but there are a couple of lighting terms that we really need to understand in order to finish our conversation. The first one is PAR, or photosynthetically active radiation. Most lights produce light over a wide spectrum, and only those spectrums that are photosynthetically active are going to drive plant growth. So we don't want to know the total light that's being emitted from a particular type of fixture. We want to know how much of it is going to be photosynthetically active for the crops that we're trying to enhance. And the other term that I'd like to discuss here is one we just mentioned, which is the daily light interval. And I think the best way to think about it, it's if you could measure instantaneously, and there are light probes that'll do this, if you could measure instantaneously all day long the amount of photosynthetically active light that's striking 1 square meter of your greenhouse space, that would give you a total light energy that's been received by those plants for the day. And that is a very useful term, and you'll see that we'll use it quite a bit here in the next few slides. This map here, first on the left-hand side, it tells you for January growing conditions what the average greenhouse, how much light is getting to the crop. And you'll see when we start talking about requirements for crops that we're talking about very low numbers, and you can see that really the northern half of the country is only getting 2 to 4 moles of light of DLI in a whole day, and even when you get further south, it's still really not adequate for most plants to have superior growth. And if you look at the map next to it, it's a way of rating across the country just how large or small the benefit of supplemental lighting is. And you see a good bit of the country during wintertime conditions would definitely benefit from supplemental lighting if the crops that you're growing, there's a payback for doing that. And here's some examples that we put together for you just to show you, how many moles of light. Remember, we were going in the northern tier of the United States in January. We're only getting 2 to 4 moles of light for our DLI during that time frame. So some of these crops, in order to grow them in a greenhouse through the wintertime, would need quite a bit of supplemental light. But again, we talked about the advantage for propagation. A lot of your young plants, liners, and plugs can be enhanced without a whole lot of extra light. This is a little bit about what they look like. There's several different technologies out there. Right now, the two most common in the greenhouse setting are high pressure sodium lamps, which is, as you can see, is abbreviated HPS, and then you've probably heard quite a bit about LEDs. At this point in time, still the majority of the greenhouse lighting going out there for supplemental lighting or high pressure sodium, and we'll talk about why that is and how that's changing. And then the light emitting diodes are coming on strong. Lots of technological advances that are making them better all the time, and we'll kind of to break these two down a little bit for you. So as of today, as I mentioned, it's still considerably more expensive to install LED fixtures into your greenhouse. Once they're installed, there are a number of ways that LEDs save you money. One is that they are more energy efficient. And part of the reason that they're more energy efficient is that with LEDs, each LED diode has a very narrow light spectrum, so it is possible to create custom recipes for light spectrums that are able to meet the requirements of the crop, so we're not wasting a lot of energy creating light that those plants don't really need. And with the high pressure sodium, there's really no adjustment to the light spectrum, and even though you've probably seen the yellow glow, the amber glow that they give off, and some of that light is not useful to the plants, so that's part of the trade-off there. In terms of the photosynthetically active light that we talked about, the LEDs do produce more light per unit of energy, so that makes them more cost effective. The LEDs run quite cool, maybe not really a big deal in a greenhouse, but if you are using them in a propagation room to start seeds, things like that, or to root cuttings, the fact that you can put multiple rows of LEDs one on top of the other in close quarters and without having a lot of heat being generated can be a big advantage. Now the HPS, because it's not as efficient, that energy that's wasted, I'll say wasted, that doesn't go into producing light, might be a better way of saying it, is given off as heat. Now, if you're obviously that heat's in the greenhouse, that can help you. If you have heat curtains, you can save a good bit of that heat. And there is a radiant heat effect that actually tends to warm up the leaf surfaces down below. That is a benefit as well. So it's certainly not all negative for HPS, not by a long shot. And as you can see here, that the light, the bulbs themselves, the light themselves, there's quite a differential in terms of the life expectancy of them. So right now, the cost of LEDs are coming down. There's actually technological advances for both types of lights that are keeping them competitive. And I think the future is very bright for having more energy efficient and more adaptable lights as time goes on. Just want to show you this really quick. This is a calculator that GGS Pro created in order to assist our customers when they're having calculations that have to do with light measurements. There can be some heavy math in there, and this really takes care of that for us. Some of the primary functions have been able to determine the light intensity required to reach the desired daily light, the DLI, the daily light integral, given the length of the photoperiod, in other words, the length of the time that they're lit. And if you already know the amount of light intensity and the length of the photoperiod, you can then use the calculator to tell you what that means in terms of your DLI. I want to let you know that Griffin is well connected for lighting sources, and we have available to us all the latest technologies. Some of them are pretty remarkable. In the LEDs, you can dim the lights remotely. You can even change the spectrum in some of these some of these units, and you can actually change the spectrum of light from your cell phone from the comfort of your living room if you would have the need to do that. And also for the HPS lights, high pressure sodium, some of the new energy saving technologies, we have that available to you well. And just a quick slide, so in your handouts you'll be able to see all the different light sources that Griffin represents. We're going to move on now to a totally different topic, although the goal is the same, and that is to make our operations more efficient and more energy efficient. So we're going to be talking about the temperature decisions that we have to make in terms of our crop production, and it's pretty complicated, but we're going to try to boil that down and help make sense of all that. So first thing we want to do is say, well, what do we need to know in order to make the best decisions for the crops that we grow? So we have a few more terms to define. These might come a little easier to you. Average daily temperature, what that is if you were to take the temperature on a 24-hour basis and average it together over the course of the day and the night, that would be your average daily temperature. The base temperature, this is probably new to most of us. What this means, there is a temperature as you take a crop and you start to decrease the temperature that is growing, and there's a certain point where below that temperature no more growth occurs. It doesn't mean the plant necessarily is killed, but the plant's going to stop growing for all intents and purposes. So that's the base temperature, and we're going to talk about that a good bit. And then the optimum temperature is looking at a different way, and if all we're concerned about is days to flower, then this would be the temperature where flowers are produced the fastest. Now, that doesn't always mean it's going to be the best quality plant. You can grow a Snapdragon much warmer than it wants to be grown at, and it may bloom a lot faster, but the quality of plant that you have won't be what you're looking for. So we have to use a mixture of these terms and in order to determine what's really best based on the individual crops. So let's take a look at that. Now on this slide here, what you see is that this is a good representation. Along the bottom axis, you can see the average daily temperature, which you just talked about, that 24-hour rolling average of the temperature in the greenhouse. And you can see for this particular crop, the base temperature looks like it's somewhere around 45 degrees. So that would maybe be considered a warm baseline crop. So below that temperature, that crop's going to stop growing altogether. And on the other side of it, you can see maybe a little bit higher than 80 degrees is the fastest time to get that crop in flower. Now, as you go past 80 degrees, you can see it falls off because at these high temperatures, this crop is stressed enough that it actually starts to take longer to flower because the plant's under so much stress from being grown at a high temperature. So we're going to put all this together. We really want to talk about, how the average daily temperature in the greenhouse affects our crop timing, about our days to finish. Really importantly, we want to talk about total fuel costs. There may be some prizes for you out there. Turning the thermostat down, sometimes it saves energy, sometimes it costs energy, and we're going to try to figure out why that happens and which crops benefit from whichever direction we're going to go with the thermostat. And last but not least, plant health and finish quality. It doesn't do us any good to reduce fuel costs if we're putting that crop under stress and predisposing it to, let's say, Pythium root rot or botrytis infestations and things like that. So for every degree that we drop the average daily temperature for a warm baseline crop, this is the crop that needs warmer temperatures in order to keep growing, the crop is delayed by much more than a cool baseline crop. So let's talk about what that might mean. If we take a crop like flowering vinca, which, as you might imagine, is a warm baseline crop, for every degree we drop that temperature, there's going to be a substantial penalty in terms of the number of days to get that crop to harvest. On the other hand, a crop like alyssum, which likes cool temperatures, for every degree of average daily temperature you drop the temperature, you get a much smaller increase in the number of days to flower. So we're going to look at these types of crops very differently. Also, when we start reducing that average daily temperature, and this is something I started to allude to just a moment ago, if we take a crop that really wants to be produced at warm temperatures, at what we call a warm baseline crop, and we start producing it at cooler temperatures, maybe because it's in a house with other things and we have to accommodate the bulk of the plants that are in the greenhouse, or we're thinking maybe we can save energy by reducing the temperature, we generally, because we delay the flowering so much, and on top of that we cause plant stress problems, that generally is a really bad cost equation for us, and we'll demonstrate that here in just a minute. On the other hand, by reducing the average daily temperature on a cool baseline crop like Alyssum or Snapdragons, I may actually save heat and at the same time improve the quality of the crop. And I think we'd all agree that Alyssum or Snapdragons grown finished cool are going to be of a superior quality. Now on this slide, we're going to take a look at a comparison of some cool base temperature crops versus some warm ones, so we can start to think about the crops that we're growing and begin to categorize them in our mind. So the cool base temperature crops are ones that they have to get quite cold before they stop growing altogether. And these are going to be characterized also by the fact that as you do decrease your average daily temperature, there will be less of a penalty in terms of increasing the number of days to flower than the plants that are on the right. So these are all warm base temperature crops. So they're going to really struggle as we start to decrease the average daily temperature. So there's going to be a much larger impact in terms of increasing the days to flower, also more quality risk by trying to grow them cooler than their optimum temperatures. In this slide here that was created by Dr. Neil Matson at Cornell University, it really demonstrates it quite well. Now, this might come as a surprise to you, but even though we think of petunias as cool crops, and certainly the bedding plant type petunias are definitely cool crops, purple wave petunia actually is a warm baseline crop. And I'll show you a slide in a minute that shows you the dramatic impacts of reducing temperature on plant growth with purple wave. So even though they're very cold tolerant, once they're at finished size, we can grow them outside, and once they're hardened off, and they'll take quite a bit of cold, but their production temperatures, in order to hit the most efficient growth pattern, need to be considerably warmer than a lot of other crops. On the flip side, the other one I circled there are crystal bowl pansies, to use as an example there. So that last column, what it tells you, for every degree that I drop the average daily temperature, I need 3.3 more days to finish off that purple wave plant and get it into bloom. By the same token, every 1 degree drop in the average daily temperature, I only get a penalty of 1.3 days for the pansies. So it really illustrates dramatically the difference between a warm baseline and a cool baseline crop. This is the slide that I was referring to, and you can see dramatically, once you get below about 68 degrees, the purple wave petunia is growing very, very slowly, and this is 42 days or 6 weeks into production. The plant grown at 54 degrees, you can see we must be close to the baseline temperature for purple wave petunias because it's hardly grown at all, whereas those grown in the 60s and the low to mid 70s are in bloom and looking great and obviously prospering with those higher average daily temperatures. What we're taking a look at here, and again, this is another way of illustrating the difference between a warm baseline crop and a cool baseline crop. As the temperature was reduced, this is the average daily temperature from 65 degrees to 60 degrees, it added 30 days of crop time to the vinca crop, but it only added 13 days to the petunia crop. Now this is the bedding plant petunia, which does have a cool base temperature as opposed to the purple wave. And this is another way of taking a look at it, but you can see just a 5-degree drop in the average daily temperature increased it caused a 50% increase in the days to finish. Now these are days from seeding to flower, they aren't from plugs in this particular case. But on my bedding plant petunias, that same decrease in temperature was only a 23% increase in the number of days to finish. So really, I think a dramatic representation of what we're talking about. What we're going to do now, we're going to use a program called Virtual Grower, and it is through the USDA. It's a wonderful program, and it's available at no cost to growers. So I included a link there so you can download it. And I think once you see some of these representations we're going to take a look at, you're going to see the potential to do a lot of different scenarios about the crops you grow and your crop timing and so forth, and make some really intelligent decisions on what the ideal temperature is to grow your crops the most efficient with your heat. So I think this will be a lot of fun for you. I hope so. I'm going to use purple wave petunias as our first example. So I used the finish times that were available from the Pan Am Seed Culture Guide, and then also the effects of temperature on finish time by Dr. Matson in order to make these tables here. So every time you use Virtual Grower, there's some inputs that you have to put in. So I picked some, and I just want to let you know what they were. So as we take a look at the data that's produced, you want to know what it was produced for. So I picked Baltimore, Maryland, because it was close to the Mason-Dixon line, something in the middle of the country. And in this case, I went with maybe a little bit more of a low-tech, a small to medium-sized greenhouse operation where we're using double poly and not the infrared type films. And you can see it's a 25 by 96 hoop house. I chose high efficiency unit heaters, but they're a couple years old and they're forced air. There's no heat underneath the bench. And these particular houses don't have any light or heat curtains. Now, you can do this and of course customize it to your location, but also you may have high-tech gutter connected greenhouses with all kinds of technology in them and heat curtains and lights and all the rest. You can create a profile for your greenhouse with all those variables added in there, so it very accurately reflects the data that you should expect from your crops. So what we did here is we took a look at purple wave petunias just grown from a 512 tray, and thinking in Baltimore, Maryland, that May 1st would be a logical time for a finish date. And what you're seeing here is the effects. We start off with a 65-degree night and a 70-degree day. And you can see that we need to plant them from that plug size on March 20th in order to finish them by May 1st. So as you go down through the chart, for every 5-degree decrease in the average daily temperature, so in this example I decreased the night and the day temperature by 5 degrees each, a couple things happen. One, if you look at the planting date, instead of planting in late March when the days are getting longer and a little warmer, now I'm planting in early March, and then if I keep dropping the temperatures, I'm getting back to almost Valentine's Day, and at the coldest temperature regime, I'm planting in late January. Well, it's not just the number of days that's hurting me then, it's the fact that these extra days of heating that I need to provide in order to grow them cooler are going back into the teeth of the winter, so it costs more to heat. The day length is shorter, and so I got a longer night to heat, and the temperatures are much colder. So you can probably anticipate what we're going to take a look at next, and that's the heating costs. So maybe contrary to what you would think, but for purple wave petunias, for every 5-degree drop in temperature, I experienced an increase in heating expenses, and it was for the reasons that we just detailed there. So it's pretty dramatic, and not just a little bit. So here's the case where turning the thermostat down is going to increase your fuel costs, and we haven't even talked about the fact that the longer they're on the bench, there's nothing else that can be grown there. There's more applications of fertilizer and perhaps insecticides and fungicides, things like that. So the fuel is only one of the costs that we're going to incur by trying to grow that crop a lot cooler. I thought it would be a good idea just to show what happens when we push our finish date back 2 weeks. And in this case, and now you can see my plant dates are a lot later, but I do use the exact same temperature regime, dropping 5 degrees each time. And here you can see, although the heating costs are significantly less than they were for the May 1st finish date, I'm still suffering the same penalty by trying to grow them colder than the optimum temperature for production. And I want to include one more slide here to drive the point home the rest of the way. You can see that if you can go to the column on the far right, those numbers represent the difference in the amount of heat that's required. Going from a May 15th date to a May 1st date, it's requiring 41%, on average about 40% more fuel in order to produce them 2 weeks earlier. And I mention that because I think sometimes, especially for small to medium-sized growers, it's easier just to bring all of a plant in at one time, all the purple wave you're going to need for the spring, and bring them in at one time. But if I don't need a third or a half of my crop to be ready until May 15th, there are some substantial fuel savings that I can enjoy just by splitting that crop in half. And I realize sometimes for smaller growers you have minimums you need to meet. It may not always work that way, but I think not only do we need to keep good records of how we're growing our crops, we also need to keep records of how they're selling, and so that we really have a good idea of how much we need for our early crop and how much of it can be deferred to a crop that started later, and enjoy the associated heat savings from that. So in a long story made short, we find that by growing purple wave cooler, we actually spend more money on fuel. We have to start them considerably earlier into the winter season, and so we're losing all around that. And then just by growing them 2 weeks later, we saved about 40% in fuel. So obviously we need to have early crops, so we got to bite the bullet on that, but when we can grow later, we want to do that. And if the other thing is, you never give up your grower sense even after you see the data, and and I know that purple wave petunias that are finished cool are of better quality. So maybe I spend the first 80 or 85% of my crop cycle growing them on the warm side, and then I'm going to harden them off and cool them off and might even put them outside to tone them up. So I get the best of both worlds. I have the shortest crop time, the most heat efficient crop timing, but then I finish them off cool, get them hardened off so the final customer is well pleased. So I thought it'd be good to take an example of one other crop. This would be a cool baseline crop, so a crop that tolerates cool temperatures quite well. So I set up a really similar scenario here. The temperature is a little bit lower to start with, but what we did again was to drop the day and the night temperature 5 degrees for each of the 4 treatments there. So you can see that there's really not as much of a difference in the plant dates, and over those 4 dates there's really less than a month difference between the start date, and that is because, as we learned earlier, for cool baseline crops, for every degree that I drop the average daily temperature, there's a much smaller penalty in terms of adding days to finish. And here, this is the exact opposite of our purple wave petunias. By lowering the temperature, I actually was able to save fuel in this case. And I think we would all agree that you get a better quality Snapdragon growing the cool rather than warm. So sometimes the fastest number of days to flower is not the best decision, either by heating costs or by. One thing I didn't mention is that by growing cooler, you can not only improve the quality of your crop, but you can extend the shelf life. And this past spring for many growers across the United States was particularly challenging due to the COVID situation, not knowing if and when they were going to be able to open up their greenhouse operations to start sales. And by growing them cooler, you have a longer shelf life. So in a spring like this past spring, that would be very beneficial. And also, most of your insects' life cycles are very much temperature driven. So by growing at much cooler temperatures, we tend to have a lot less insect problems as well. So we're going to change gears just a little bit here. We're still talking about our efficiency and our production times, and we're going to talk about the effects of the size of a plug and the age of the plug on finish time. So this research was done some years ago by Dr. Paul Fisher and some of his associates, and it's very interesting. And what they did in the first of 2 trials, they had different plug size trays, but they direct stuck calibrachoas into these different count trays. And then 4 weeks later, they transplanted them all up to 4.5-inch pots to see what the finish time was. And the finish time was exactly the same, whether they used a 50 tray or 144 tray. And that is because with just 4 weeks in the plug tray, the size of the plug had not yet been the limiting factor. Now, totally different scenario here. Now what we're going to do is, based on the size plug, they're going to add weeks of production. So for the smaller size plug trays, it's a 4-week-old plug. But as we get into the medium-sized plug trays, now it's staying in that plug tray for 6 weeks. And then they went even as large as a 2-inch plug or a 32 tray count, and they were able to keep the liners in those trays for 8 weeks. Well, now these are, again, this was calibrachoas in a 4.5-inch pot, and I'll look at the days to finish in the right-hand column. So you can see that it is possible to do a lot of the growing in the plug trays where they're at a much higher density, they don't take as much space and therefore as much heat, and then cut down on the crop time, the finish time there. So pretty dramatic representation of that, and there's many variations of this that you might employ at your greenhouse. I want to share a little bit of a case study with you. This is a grower. There's a good friend of mine from the Richmond, Virginia area, and their specialty are 10-inch hanging baskets and larger containers of combinations, and they use an awful lot of vegetative petunias in there. In order to reduce the cost of starting this many plants, they actually grow them in 4-inch pots, pot to pot, on the floor of just a simple hoop house greenhouse, so a very low-cost structure there. They make weekly applications of Fluorel at 500 parts per million. Now, when they do this, it does a couple of things. One, Fluorel keeps those plants vegetative, and certainly at this stage of the crop production, we don't want them wasting any energy on flower production, but it also is a branching agent, as you might be aware. So now we have plants that are, and also I should add this as well, it also reduces internode elongation, so they're not stretching. So by making these applications, they keep them vegetative, and they're able to grow them at a high density for a long period of time because the internodes are tight, and they've done a great job regulating them. And they did also add 1 bonsai drench at 2 parts per million, again, to keep them very nice and very vegetative. Now, when they transplant out of those 4-inch pots into their hanging baskets and their combos, they just explode and they finish very quickly. So this is kind of the same thing we were just talking about in the plug size, just taken to another order of magnitude by using 4-inch pots to store those plants, if you want to think of it that way. And here's what they look like. Pot to pot, you can see they're beautiful, and there's no flower buds in the growing tips, and they're grown at a very high density and exactly what they were trying to achieve. We're going to finish up today talking about outdoor production of spring crops, and some growers were forced into doing this without planning for it this past spring, but there's an awful lot of other growers, even in cooler climates and colder climates, that plan on this, and there's some big benefits for certain crops, and we want to talk about that a little bit. Some of the advantages of outdoor production are, and we talked about this a little bit with the Snapdragon example, it slows down the maturity and increases the shelf life of the plant. So that we all know what happens when we've got a crop ready for sale and then the weather goes south on us and we're sitting on this crop, and sometimes it gets overgrown enough we have to cut it back, and then we really lose our profit there. So increasing shelf life is one way to reduce shrinkage and improve your bottom line. When we grow outside, there's a number of physiological factors that improve the quality of plants those that will tolerate cold temperatures. It's a combination, not only the cooler temperatures, but the light levels outside naturally are as high as they're going to get. There's no structure overhead. And even the wind moving through the crop and rustling the foliage causes a response to keep those plants well toned. It keeps the inner nodes short and produces really high quality plants. I had a grower joking, telling me that he puts his petunias outside so early, they get so tough that he can walk across the top of the hanging baskets without hurting the plants. I'm quite sure that's an exaggeration, but you understand what he's saying. Again, with these cold temperatures, very little insect and mite pressure outdoors. And maybe the best part of all is that by moving these cold tolerant crops outside early, we free up the heated space, because the heated space is our limiting factor in how much we can produce for that crush of the spring crop. And by moving these crops outside, we get to put another turn in on the space that's heated where they come out of. I put two lists together for you. The first one's going to be on cold tolerant seed grown annuals, and the next one will be on vegetative annuals. You might dicker with my list a little bit. That's okay. I'm talking about 25, 30 years of experience working with growers and doing outdoor growing myself back in the day when I had my own greenhouses. And that's how I put this list together, but you may add to it, and you may decide some of them don't deserve to be on there. Most of the crops on here will take a light freeze. Some of them will take quite a bit of cold and temperatures down even in the low 20s. I've had Dusty Miller down to 25 degrees at my own operation, and it was well hardened off, but it survived it just fine. And I've seen pansies even down to around 20 degrees, and the flowers were full of frost and bent over to the ground, and a couple hours later they popped up and they were doing great. So there's some really cold tolerant seed annuals on this list. The vegetative annuals, a little bit more nuanced. There's a couple that have an asterisk next to them, and those are ones that will tolerate a frost, but a hard freeze should be avoided for them. But again, you have a good selection of vegetative annuals that are candidates to go outside for early season production. When we talk about doing outdoor growing, the selection of the site is going to be really important, and for some of us, there's just not going to be a suitable place to do it, and that can happen sometimes. But obviously, we want a full sun location because and we're talking about late winter, early spring growing, so we want to make sure we maximize the amount of light getting to that crop, and it really needs to be well drained. Sometimes we still have some melting snow piles around the edges of the fields for this early production time, or we can get persistent heavy rains that time of year. So if the field doesn't drain well, we're going to run into problems with waterlogged pots and start losing plants. We want to also avoid low spots. If you have some property, low spots, we know that colder air is heavier, more dense than warmer air. So on a very still night when the temperatures are dropping fast, those low spots are going to be the coldest spots around because the cold air settles in there. So if you can avoid that, that'd be great. If you can't, at the very least, make sure that you put your most cold tolerant crops in the lowest spots in the field to avoid damage. Windbreaks can be useful because sometimes we get as much windburn damage from crops we put outside as we do cold damage. If your windbreaks are arranged in such a way as they're not substantially shading the crop, they can be quite beneficial. Gravel beds are fine. Also, the ground cover fabric. Remember, our operative condition here is to make sure that it drains well. So as long as it's draining well, you can use any of these types of methods to produce your outdoor crops. It is really important. Sometimes when we're moving outside and sometimes we'll be limited on space, it's tempting to make very small aisles or make our aisles very far apart in the blocks of plants that we're putting outside. It's really necessary that we plan ahead and have enough that our rows are close enough together and they're wide enough that if we have to do some spraying, we can get in there. And maybe more importantly for these types of crops, if we need to go out there and cover the crop because of unusually cold weather that could cause damage, we have to have enough space that we can actually accomplish that. Some growers have the luxury of having low-cost cold frame structures available to them, and which really is an ideal situation if you have it. They're unheated typically, and they have roll-up sides on them. And part of the problem we have growing outside, not only can we get some unseasonably cold air or high winds, but sometimes the heavy rain is enough on certain species of plants to damage those blooms that we want. So if you have a cold frame structure with that overhead, it certainly mitigates those particular problems that you might run into. It's really important how we harden the plants off before we put them outside. So the first thing we're going to say is that that plant needs to be well rooted through the pot. So we don't want to take recent transplants and put them outside. They need to be well established. Typically, a week of night temperatures in the low 40s is sufficient to harden them off before they can go outside and harden off the rest of the way. So that goes back to your planning to try to keep these crops that are going to end up outside together so that you'll have whole parts of the range or whole individual greenhouses that will be able to be cooled down in order to satisfactorily harden them off before they go outside. What I always like to do before I put crops outside, of course, you know, if you're going to be a horticulturist, you also have to be a meteorologist. So we spend a lot of time watching weather forecasts. And I would look for a spell of weather where for 3 nights it wasn't supposed to freeze hard. And that would be the time I put them outside. And that would let them harden off the rest of the way and just make them as tough as they're going to get. There are some other things that you can do. Sometimes it's a good idea just before they go out into the field to reduce your fertilizer just a little bit. We don't want plants that are soft and succulent growing rapidly due to high rates of fertilizer going outside. And sometimes a light application of plant growth regulators, depending on the crop, may enhance their tolerance to cold as well. Pageant Intrinsic is a fungicide, but it's a strobilurin type fungicide and has been shown to increase cold tolerance in quite a few different types of plants. And generally you can add a couple of degrees of cold tolerance to them. And unlike the fungicide spray, when we're using it for this purpose, we're using low rates, usually 6 to 8 ounces per 100 gallons. And do want to point out, if you're going to use Pageant, that you never want to add capsule to it. The label tells you not to use organosilicon surfactants with it. There's 2 ways you can do it. If you're going to make one application, then somewhere in that range of 2 to 7 days before the expected freeze events is when you want to make that application. For maximum cold protection, you want to make 2 sprays, and the first one is about 2 weeks ahead of that, and then the second one about 4 days before the cold event. So if you're able to plan ahead, there are 2 different ways that you can preload plants with Pageant to gain a couple more degrees of cold tolerance. We talked a little bit about applying PGRs. If you're going to make that application, make sure you apply the PGRs while they're still in the warm greenhouse. B9, in this particular case, damaged petunias, and it was quite cold outside when the B9 was applied. So get your PGR applications done before you put them out. So we talked a little bit about possibly having the need to cover these plants if something unseasonably cold happens after you got the plants outside. You can either take your chances or you can try to cover them. Now there's 2 different types that we usually see out there. The row cover fabric is very lightweight. It's a spun material. You can actually usually see your hand through it. It's that lightweight. It's very easy to work with, and it does give you a couple degrees of frost protection. 2 things happen. One, it does trap a little bit of the radiational heat coming back off of the ground at night, but it also tends to, on a frosty night, the frost tends to set up more on the fabric than it does on the crop. So there's 2 ways that might benefit you. There's a totally different type of fabric that is much thicker that both of these products breathe, but the winter protection fabric is most often used on perennial crops for overwintering, but some growers will also use it for this purpose. So it's a lot heavier and thicker, so it's going to provide a good bit more protection from the cold. The downside is that since it's heavier and we're not putting frames out in order to lay these fabrics on, you may sustain a little bit of crop damage on certain crops because of the weight of the winter protection fabric, but that will certainly give you the most cold protection. It's really important when you cover the crop up. If you go much past mid-afternoon, the ground is starting to radiate off the heat that is gathered during the day, and that is our heat source. So the covering that we're putting all over top of the crop is an attempt to gather as much of the radiational heat out of that we're getting from the day out of the soil as we can before nightfall. So mid-afternoon is about as late as you want to put it over the crop on those especially cold nights. And here's a picture here that'll show you the difference between the winter protection fabric, which is considerably thicker than the frost blanket that's pictured down below. Here's a picture from Pleasant View Gardens up in New Hampshire, and we talked about the fact that you need to leave enough room between the rows to get the winter protection fabric out there, and you can see that although it's a tight fit and they're making the most of their space, they are able to have that out in the field, and if they need to cover it, it's right there and can be done relatively quickly. Sometimes we get questions from growers about whether or not they can use overhead sprinklers in order to protect their crops from hard freezes and frost. And most of us have seen pictures from Florida where the citrus groves are being protected from unseasonably cold weather and freezes by overhead sprinklers, and they're all covered with icicles. Well, there's something called latent heat of vaporization. What that means is that when water turns from a liquid into ice, it actually releases a little bit of heat. But there's some things we need to know about using overhead sprinklers. One of them is that the overhead sprinklers need to be turned on when the air temperature is 34 degrees. We can't wait until it is colder than that and still be successful. And the other thing that we need to know, and maybe this is the most important part of it, that we need to continue to have those overhead sprinklers running until all the ice is melted off the plants in the morning. And if you can meet those conditions, then you can definitely gain several degrees of protection from freezing. You don't have to necessarily have the sprinkler, on them consistently. You can see from this last bullet point here that if you have a rapidly rotating sprinkler, as long as you're getting 2 rotations or more per minute, you can use those type of sprinklers, and that will allow you to cover more ground with less sprinklers. It does require a good bit of water, so 60 gallons per minute per acre. So hopefully, if this is something you're planning on doing, you have an adequate water supply in order to be able to do that. The other thing that I want to mention, because this is a common problem, sometimes in the spring a grower wakes up and it got colder than they thought and they see frost on their plants, and their first instinct is to pick up the hose and go wash it off of them. And the truth of the matter is that will definitely increase the destruction of the frost. And the reason is that when the water, when you put the water on the crop in the morning and it starts to evaporate off, you go in a different direction. We said that you give off heat when you go from water to ice, but it actually takes heat to go from water to evaporation, so it causes the cooling. So those plants that might have been at 32 degrees from the frost being on them now are suddenly at 27 or 28 degrees because when the water started to evaporate off of them, then it started to cool those leaf surfaces even further. So if you wake up and you got frost on your plants, you just have to hang in there and wait till the sun melts it off. You actually will make it worse by applying water overhead. And while we're on the topic of water, we know that a lot of the damage that occurs from frost and freeze is through desiccation and dehydration. So well-watered plants will resist the damage of freeze and frost better than plants that are run dry. And that because we know that moist soil holds more heat than dry soil as well. This is the picture. This is done by Joe Moore and his growers down in southern New Jersey. And this is an example where they have multiple cold frame greenhouses. So this Babylon verbena was grown for 4 weeks in warm temperatures and then finished 6 weeks out in the cold frame. And you can see that it is absolutely a beautiful basket. You really couldn't grow it any better than that. Just to let you know that we're not giving away quality. If we pick the right crops to go outside, we're not giving away quality in order to save some heat in this case. painted a pretty rosy picture of outdoor production, so we need to talk about the flip side. It's not always rosy out there. The weather obviously is unpredictable, and the date to go outside that worked so well last year may not work this year. The weather may turn colder after you've been outside. And so when that happens, sometimes we take some crop damage or we can delay crops, and that's another good reason to make sure we're getting pretty close to the finish line in terms of maturity before we put these crops outside. In spring times, we have repeated rains. It can be very difficult to keep the nutrients in the crop, so we can have some plants that look like they're getting washed out nutritionally, and something that needs to be managed as well. And as I mentioned earlier, the heavy wind and rains can sometimes foul open blooms. And in some parts of the country, animal feeding can be really a problem. I think deer like to eat just about everything that we grow, but they're not the only ones out there that are eating plant materials. So that's something that you'll have to determine locally whether or not that's going to be a risk for you. And I wanted to end with this slide. Joe Moore and his group at Lucas Greenhouses are putting a lot of plant material out early in the spring, and they have a great system for doing that. But Joe likes to say, sometimes you get the bear and sometimes the bear gets you. In this particular case, not only did his outdoor crops get snowed on, but the temperature went well down into the 20s. But I'm happy to report that 100% of the plant material pulled through it. But obviously, that was probably a pretty tough morning when Joe came out to take a look at that out in their outdoor fields. Thanks so much for your attention. I'm really glad that you were part of this presentation today. Thank you so much for being a part of today's online presentation. If you have any questions regarding today's presentation, GGS Pro is standing by to answer them. You can use any of the 4 methods that you see here on this slide. If today doesn't suit you, you can feel free to reach out to GGS Pro by the email address or by the phone extension at any point in the future. Thanks again for participating in the webinar.